Thanks, Ross. And thank you all for being here this afternoon. Excited to get to talk about this work. I was going to say this is a long time coming, but we actually had a relatively short timeline to put this project together. The governor's office reached out to us last September and asked us if we had the capability and the capacity to update a report that was done by ISER in 2016. Obviously, in 2016, the state was facing considerable fiscal crunch. Oil prices were down. Production had been declining for a number of years. And so the governor's office at the time commissioned ISER to consider kind of a basket of fiscal options. And so we were asked if we could update and expand that study. I'll talk about a couple of ways in which we've updated it and expanded it, but I think it's an important reference point to have in your head that we're trying to take some of the work that was done in 2016, update it and expand it to 2026. Just want to add a couple of disclaimer notes here. While this work was supported by the governor's office as it was in 2016, the entirety of this work reflects the conclusions of myself and my co-authors and shouldn't be attributed to the institute that we work for, or our university, or the research sponsors. Give you a little preview of our presentation today. I'm going to provide you some context for this work, kind of turn our eyes in the review mirror for a minute before we shine the headlights out to see what the future looks like. I'll tell you about the scope of the analysis that we conducted, what was considered kind of inbounds and out of bounds for our analysis. I'll walk you through just a sliver of the results today. The work that we did explored a number of different economic impacts that would result from these different fiscal options. And so we'll just look at one set of fiscal or economic outcomes today in employment. And then I'll point you in the direction for seeing how you can look at alternative outcomes. We'll walk through a couple of key takeaways from this work, sort of directionally how things have changed since 2016. And then I'll point you in the direction of some of those additional resources. So I mentioned the important background for this work was this 2016 study published by ISER for evaluating short-run impacts of budget options. Does anybody remember that 2016 study? I'm always curious. Yeah, it seems to have been frequently referenced in the interim since it was published. My former colleagues, Muhsin Katabi, Gunnar Knapp, Matt Berman were the lead authors on that work. So the purpose of this analysis is to update that 2016 study. 2016, unfortunately, was 10 years ago now. And so data has changed, the Alaska economy has changed, policy has changed, and so we want to incorporate those changes into the analysis. We also want to include some expanded options. So the 2016 ISER study evaluated 10 fiscal options. We're going to evaluate 11, along with some variations of those options. But importantly, I want to make this point, I'll probably make it again throughout the presentation, is that we're not trying to make any specific recommendations as to which of these options the state should potentially adopt, if any of them. What we are trying to do is provide some context for the conversations that our state has been having for decades now with some updated information as we have those conversations. And this is a slightly more subtle point, but kind of a variation on that theme, is that we're not trying to estimate how much any specific policy would raise. And so oftentimes, the Alaska Department of Revenue is tasked with putting together fiscal notes on particular pieces of legislation. All of the fiscal options that we're analyzing in our study are generic, right? Too generic to attach a particular fiscal note to. And while we'll need to estimate the hypothetical amounts of revenue that each of those options could raise, this should not be taken as a substitute for the type of work that the Department of Revenue does when they put together a fiscal note, where they need a lot more precision and a particular policy in front of them. So we're not analyzing any specific policy proposal. This isn't an analysis of any particular piece of legislation that has been introduced or that could be potentially introduced, but generic analysis of these options that's meant to inform debates, not necessarily, again, provide specific revenue estimates. And then finally, I'll make the point that economic impacts are just one of many considerations for policymakers. We should also consider things like the administrative burden of these different fiscal options as they are implemented, both for the state, but maybe also local governments. There's implementation considerations, there's equity concerns, any number of these ancillary considerations, in addition to economic impacts that should be considered. And potentially those considerations are even more important than the economic impacts, which I'm presenting today. However, we're economists. We're tasked with evaluating the economic impact, so that's what we're doing here today. But just note that that's a limitation of this study, is that these economic impacts are just one of many that you could consider. So I noted stuff has changed in the last decade. Exactly what's changed? So our economy has changed, our petroleum industry has changed, and policy has changed. So how has our economy changed? Our economy is diversified since 2016. The contribution of the oil industry has contracted, while all other industries have grown. So we're slightly less reliant on oil today than we were then. There's been growth in our visitor industry. And as I think I saw on the ADN yesterday or the day before, so is the composition of our non-resident workforce. I believe Department of Labor estimated that last year we set a record high of non-resident workers, at least for as long as they've been tracking those data, which I think is over the last 26 years. Our petroleum industry has changed in the last decade. We're moving into new areas of the state that we haven't produced in before. The National Petroleum Reserve of the Arctic is a new area of opportunity for development. But there's important considerations from the standpoint of state revenue as oil production moves into new geography, particularly owned by the federal government, where we don't have royalty interest. And, for the first time in the last 30, 40 years, we're actually looking at production forecasts that are turning up rather than continuing to turn down. That provides us potentially some opportunity. And then finally, one of the other things that's changed since 2016 is policy. At the federal level, a really important change was the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which I might refer to as TICJA later in the presentation. The 2017 tax cuts did a couple of things. They flattened the tax schedule a little bit. They removed certain deductions that individuals could take. And importantly, there was a cap that was placed on state and local tax deductions. So when ISER evaluated various options in 2016, those options would have some of their costs borne by the federal government through state and local tax deductions that income taxpayers in Alaska could apply against their federal tax liability. With this SALT cap now in place as part of TICJA, that amount has been reduced, and so the federal government is going to pick up less of the tab from fiscal policy, broad-based taxes that our state might implement. And then finally, another important policy change that we've seen at a state level is we've seen some major fiscal changes since 2016. So this is a graph that shows real per capita unrestricted general fund spending from 2007, fiscal year 2007, to FY 2026. You can see that I've noted here FY 2016 when the ISER study came out. This line is not meant to imply that the ISER study caused this decline in unrestricted general fund spending. But again, it coincided with a time when the state was under severe fiscal pressure and was helping to provide context for the different options that the state had. So these are inflation-adjusted dollars and adjusted to the state's population. Now, the state's population actually hasn't changed that much in the last 10 or 15 years. We've experienced net out-migration, but we've experienced natural population increase, which has mostly been a wash for aggregate population. So that hasn't been changing much. But obviously, we've experienced a period, particularly in the last 5 years, of a lot of inflation. And so while nominal dollars have continued to creep up a little bit in inflation-adjusted terms, you can see that the state's real inflation-adjusted per capita spending has been roughly flat since 2016. But you can see that over this time period, we've put downward pressure on spending. So if you look at the average growth rate in spending from 2007 to 2015 on this per capita basis, state spending was growing at an annual rate of about 8.9%, almost 9% per year. Since 2016, from the 2017 to 2026 period, it's been contracting by almost 3% per year, again, in real per capita terms. The key drivers of this contraction, so if we just compare the FY 2016 budget to the FY 2026 budget, what have been the major drivers of that decline? We appropriated from 2016 to 2026 $1 billion less in permanent fund dividends and $1.6 billion less in operating expenditures, for a total of a reduction in our budget in real terms, inflation-adjusted terms, of $2.6 billion, right? So the state's per capita and absolute spending levels have declined since 2016. So that's been an important change, right? We've made fiscal change. Another important change that the state has made is we've taken a number of actions related to revenue. And I think certainly the most important of these actions was SB 26, which established the percent of market value formula for how the state manages its revenue that it receives from the permanent fund. This provided the state more flexibility in how permanent fund revenue was received and could be expended. Now the state has access to using that money for the general fund, for its general fund obligations. But there have been other revenue measures that the state has engaged in since then, since 2016, including the elimination of cashable credits for oil and gas production, and then several actions related to carbon capture and sequestration, which could provide new opportunity for revenue in the future. I bring up both of these points, that the state's done things with respect to expenditure and the state has done things with respect to revenue, because one of the things that I've heard sort of perennially from Alaskans over the last 10 years is they feel a sense of intransigence over this issue of state fiscal policy, that the state hasn't accomplished much over this time period in trying to move the needle. And I want to point out some of these major actions that the state has taken. We've reduced expenditures, we've diversified and expanded the way that we can collect revenue from the permanent fund. So the state has taken important action. And that has provided some change in kind of the context from where we sat in 2016 when ISER did this study then. And yet it feels like we haven't quite closed the gap yet, that there's still pressure on the state budget, that a year or two of lower than expected oil prices could again put the state in a pretty dicey financial situation. And so it makes sense for us to consider potentially some alternative options, fiscal options, to provide additional revenue to the state, to continue to put downward pressure on expenditures. And so what we are doing in this study is evaluating what the ripple effects through the economy might be of implementing any one of those options. So in this study, we're going to evaluate 11 fiscal options and 3 variations of those options. So 3 of these options are going to be changes related to state government spending. 6 of them are going to be related to changes in household income. Think of these as changes to the permanent fund dividend amounts that would be appropriated or some form of broad-based taxes. And then 2 were changes in the business tax environment, more narrow taxes directed at the oil and gas industry, more broad taxes directed at the industry as a whole. And notice I'm using the word change here with respect to each of these 3 categories, because at least with respect to category 1 and category 3, we could increase the amount of state spending or decrease the amount of state spending. We could increase oil or broad-based business taxes or decrease them. And we could change up or down the level of permanent funded dividend appropriations. In terms of broad-based taxes, those can only go in one direction because currently we don't collect any of those at a state level. And so note the word change here, that we could think about these as potential increases or decreases. And then finally, we model 3 variations of these scenarios: a seasonal sales tax, an income tax where individuals could apply their permanent fund dividends as a tax credit against their state tax liability. Both of these are designed to try to push off onto non-resident Alaskans more of the burden of raising revenue. And then finally, we modeled a scenario where corporate taxes could be potentially offset with incentives for employment. So if corporations that operate in the state hire Alaskans or increase their employment levels, what effect would that have sort of differentially from a broad-based employment agnostic form of corporate tax? So those are the scenarios we considered. What about the outcomes that we evaluated? What are the economic impacts that we're measuring here? So we're measuring 3 types of outcomes in this study. We measure how Alaskans of higher and lower incomes might be affected by these different options, right? Different options have different impacts on higher versus lower income folks. We ask the question, who pays for these different options? How will the burden of raising additional revenue or increased or further reductions in expenditures affect residents, non-resident workers, visitors to our state, or the federal government, right? The federal government can pick up some of the tab through reductions in federal income taxes. And then we also measure various economic impacts. Economic impacts like employment, income, population, prices, gross domestic product for the state. And we measure these over 2 time periods. We measure these in the short run before the economy can make broader adjustments to itself, and in the longer term. After all, in the longer term, the economy starts to make adjustments, people adapt to these different fiscal options, and some of these impacts become larger in the long run, some of them become smaller. Provide a little bit more specificity here on the fiscal options that we considered. So those 3 options that change state spending would be a cut to the state or change to the state's workforce level, clean changes to the capital budget, and clean changes to broad spending. Now, what do I mean by clean here? Well, many of the dollars that we spend in our capital budget or our operating budget are tied to some federal matching dollars. And so any changes that we make to our state's capital budget that affects matching dollars, either in transportation or energy potentially, will have an impact on those federal match dollars. So in both of these scenarios, we assume that no federal dollars are impacted by these changes. I'm actually not sure that it would be possible to reduce our capital budget much further without impacting federal dollars, but that's the assumption that we are making in our analysis, that no federal dollars would be impacted here. Similarly, for clean operating budget changes, we're thinking that the state's not going to touch any of its federal match programs like Medicaid, food stamp payments, those programs, which would also be federally matched. And if changes were made to those programs, the impacts would be larger than the assumed clean changes that we're estimating here. We estimated the effects of 6 different revenue options that would affect household income. Changes to the permanent fund dividend, either increasing or decreasing the appropriation. A broad sales tax, which would include fewer exclusions. We would exclude healthcare, education, and components of shelter. We estimated the effects of a narrower sales tax, which would exclude those same items plus food at home and all shelter now. We estimated the effects of a flat income tax, a progressive income tax, which we modeled as a federal income tax surcharge, which actually I think Alaska used prior to the repeal of the income tax in 1981, and then a statewide residential property tax. I want to note here that this broad and narrow sales tax is not modeled after any particular piece of legislation that's currently being debated or put forward. These are 2 generic versions of these 2 proposals. Similarly, with the flat and progressive income tax, these aren't modeled after any particular piece of legislation. They're generic flat income taxes, which are a percentage of Alaska's adjusted gross income, and a progressive income tax, which again is just a federal surcharge on the amounts that Alaskans are paying currently. And then finally, we measured 2 changes to the business tax environment. Narrow change to petroleum industry fees, royalties, and taxes. I might refer to this later in the presentation as government take, although that concept might not totally apply to revenues, depending on how you think about this issue philosophically. And then broader changes to the corporate environment, which also might include fees. Now, the way in which Alaska collects revenue from the petroleum industry is complicated. We ignore many of those complications in our analysis. What we are doing is generically extracting $100 million from the oil industry and transferring it to the state, right? So we're not choosing any particular mechanism that facilitates that transfer. So we're not modeling a change in the per barrel credit structure or a change in the S corporation status, a tax status of the corporate income tax, changes in the minimum tax, changes in the net profits tax. We're not modeling any of those particular features. We're taking $100 million out of the oil industry and dropping it in the state's general fund. Similarly, with broad corporate taxes, while the state has a corporate income tax, we are not modeling changes to that corporate income tax. Again, we are just generically removing $100 million from the businesses that operate in Alaska and transferring them to the state, proportionate to the scale of those businesses. So I want to give you a preview of the results here. Generally speaking, and a big caveat here generally, big asterisks, we'll talk about the asterisks in a second, you can group options into 3 buckets based on their impacts to the economy. Those with smaller impacts are those that change the business tax environment, either narrowly through petroleum tax changes or more broadly through broad business tax changes. Moderate impacts are those associated with these change in household income, either through changes in the permanent fund dividend or through some form of broad-based taxes. And then the largest impacts that we estimate are for changes in state spending. Now, I mentioned this big caveat that corporate tax changes, state capital spending, and property taxes are notable exceptions because they don't fall quite as cleanly into these three categories, depending on the outcome that you're looking at or the time frame that you're evaluating. Remember, we're evaluating both in the short term, maybe the next couple of years or so, all the way out to 2050 in terms of the impacts that these changes would have on the economy. Some of these impacts get larger over time, some of them get smaller over time, and depending on exactly what time frame you're looking at, options kind of move between these categories. But this is broadly consistent with what we find. So let's talk about one slice of our results, which is how would employment change in the state of Alaska if we used any of these particular options to remove or for the state to close $100 million in a hypothetical deficit. Now, what do I mean by a hypothetical deficit? Well, last year the state had a roughly balanced budget. And so in order for any of these options to kind of materialize, we'd have to imagine that the state had a hypothetical deficit. So let's imagine that the state has a $100 million hypothetical deficit, and we were going to use one of these levers to close that deficit. Rather than pulling that money out of savings from either the constitutional budget reserve or the earnings reserve account of the permanent fund, let's imagine that we use one of these other options to close the deficit. What impact would that have on the economy? So the first set of results that I'm going to show you are what I will call short-term static employment impacts. And when I say short-term, I mean a 1 to 2 year time frame. And when I say static, what I mean is that this is before the economy has an opportunity to adjust to any of these fiscal options materializing. So these are the short-run static changes to employment. You can see the scale here ranges from about 0 jobs on the far left-hand side to about 1,200 jobs on the far right-hand side, to give you a sense of scale here. And again, these are the jobs that would be lost from extracting $100 million from the economy to service a hypothetical $100 million deficit. And as you can see here is the pattern that I broadly characterized on the previous slide, where changes to state spending have more significant impacts on employment than changes to the business tax environment, either through changes in oil taxes or corporate taxes. And then these other options, which broadly change household income, fall in between, right? They're more moderate. Some of them are a little bit smaller and a little bit closer to the change in corporate taxes. Capital budget's a little bit smaller than the other two options, but broadly, they're consistent with this pattern. And what you'll see is that this pattern holds up roughly when we look at what are called dynamic impacts. And when I say dynamic impacts, this is a different model that we use that allows the economy to more fully adjust to these shocks that we are providing it, right? And so this model allows consumers to change their behavior. For example, if we implemented a sales tax that was narrower and we're only taxing certain categories of goods, consumers might switch to consuming non-tax goods, right? And so this model allows for a more full reflection of that change. It also allows for migration in and out of the state of Alaska. So for example, if we cut the state's workforce and the labor markets are relatively loose or have a lot of slack in them, we might see some out-migration from the state from that. Similarly, if we increase taxes on residents or businesses, we might see out-migration from that. Again, if there's a lot of slack in the labor market, or sorry, a lot of slack in the labor market. And so, but broadly, we see the same pattern that we saw on the previous slide, where business tax changes and now this residential property tax have less significant impacts on the economy than changes to the state budget, which have more significant impacts. And then finally, we use our dynamic model to look out as far as the headlights can shine, out to 2050, and see what the impacts would be in the longer term. In the longer term, after 25 years, the economy can more fully adjust to these changes. And so you see directionally, for many of these options, the impacts on employment get a little bit smaller than they are in the short run. But you still see this general pattern emerge that the changes to state spending are more significant or have a more significant impact on employment than these other options, which are less significant over this longer period of time. I mentioned on the kind of summary of the results that not every category of fiscal option fits cleanly into those buckets that I described earlier of more or less significant impact. And one of those is changes in corporate taxes. And so you can see that for many of these options, the effect of them on employment contracts pretty significantly over time. So the economy adjusts more fully to these changes. Changes to the state's workforce is a little bit stickier in the longer term, as are changes in corporate taxes. So these corporate tax changes are a little bit stickier. The economy seems to not want to adjust to those as quickly. We're providing a disincentive for capital investment. That disincentive for capital investment shows up in long-term growth, which has a drag on employment in the longer term. So frequently asked questions that we've been getting about these different scenarios. How do we think about combining two or more of these options together? The way that we've modeled them, any of these scenarios could be mixed and matched, and our model would produce the same results. However, in reality, we might expect there to be feedback effects from combined options. So for example, if we were to enact changes in state spending and income tax changes, that might have particular implications that are unique to that particular combination of options. We don't have the sophistication to model the various combinations of options, and in fact, their number of combinations are quite large. So there's not any of these feedback effects from combining options. All of them can be thought of independently. Another question that we've been getting is the effect of a PFD cut different than the effect of a PFD increase? So in our model, indeed they are. Or sorry, no, they're actually the same. So anything that goes up must come down. Our model assumes that each of these has an equal and opposite employment impact. So if we look at the employment impact of a permanent fund dividend reduction of about 400 jobs from a PFD cut, that would result in a $100 million deficit reduction. If we were to appropriate an additional $100 million to the dividend, we would expect a $400 employment increase in the economy. So 400 jobs lost from a $100 million reduction, 400 jobs gained from an additional appropriation of $100 million, hypothetically. So these results are symmetric for increases and decreases. However, the real economy may not function that way. That's just how it is modeled in the software that we use. Another question we've been getting is what would happen if instead of raising $100 million from each of these options, we raise $300 million? So our model assumes that the economic impact of a $300 million change would just be 3 times larger. So in other words, we're making an assumption of linearity. However, in reality, it could be 3.5 times larger or 2.5 times larger, as the economy might adjust differently to different levels of taxes. But the software that we use is limited to this assumption of linearity. So we carry that assumption over. And then finally, what happens to the money removed from the economy via cuts or taxes? It's important to remember that nothing happens to this money. It's servicing a hypothetical deficit and not recycled. And that's important because if we're dealing with a balanced budget, or starting with a balanced budget, we introduce some type of tax, we are likely to offset that with either increases in spending or reduction in some other tax. And that will have economic implications that should be thought of as the combination of those two options going in opposite directions. And so we're assuming that no revenue is recycled here. Again, all these options are modeled independently. So that's broadly speaking what the economic impacts in terms of employment look like for these different options. When you look at it in terms of the income, personal income changes, gross domestic product changes, migration in and out of the state, they roughly fall kind of along these same lines, where the more significant impacts are attributable to state spending changes, the less significant ones attributable to these other forms of revenue options. But if folks are interested, we can look at those in more detail after the presentation. The second outcome that we considered was who would pay for these different options. How would higher and lower income households how would they be affected? So we're a little bit limited here because we're not evaluating any specific policy proposals, but the way in which you might change state spending would have really big implications for this question here. So for example, if we change state spending programs that are income targeted, think programs like food stamps or Medicaid, that will obviously have much bigger impact on those low-income households than changes to things like road maintenance, which might have more evenly distributed impacts for higher and lower income households. Similarly, we didn't have the data to understand how business tax changes would affect higher and lower income Alaskans. When you change taxes on businesses have 3 ways in which they can respond to that change. They can either pass that new tax on to their customers, and so that would result in higher prices for the customers. And depending on what industry or what type of business you're talking about, that would have different impacts for higher and lower income households. they could pass that tax on to their employees by either not hiring or firing or putting downward pressure on wage growth. That obviously has implications depending on whether those employees are higher or lower income. And then finally, businesses might just eat the tax themselves. And so that would be a cost to the owners of those businesses. And again, there are small businesses that have lower income households that are owners of them, and larger businesses that have higher income households that are owners of them. We don't have the data to be able to evaluate those business tax changes, and so we don't do them as part of our analysis, but they're an important consideration. Of the options that we do have the data and the policy specificity to evaluate, the PFD is the most regressive of the evaluated options. And what I mean by regressive is that it would have the largest impact, both in absolute terms and as a proportion of total household income on lower income Alaskans. The most progressive option, meaning the option that would have the most impact on higher income households, is a progressive income tax. In between these two options would exist sales taxes, flat income taxes, and property taxes. So here's a visualization of the progressivity and regressivity of these different options. So as I mentioned before, the progressive income tax is the most progressive. The PFD reduction is the most regressive. Here, what I've done is I've showed how much these households would lose in terms of their per person income by which option we adopted, what hypothetically we adopted. The households that are on the far left-hand side of this figure are the poorest 10% of households in the state. The households at the far right-hand side of the figure are the richest 10% of households in the state, and deciles of income in between. So here you can see that for permanent fund dividend reductions, the poorest 10% of households would lose about $159 per person if we were raising $100 million through PFD reductions. But what you notice about this line that's kind of interesting is that it actually declines as we move to higher income households. The reason for that is that lower income households pay some either small or no federal income taxes, right? So they're receiving the full amount of that dividend. And so removing that dividend income from them, they take the full hit for. If we remove $159 of PFD income from the richest 10% of households, they have an effective federal income tax rate of 30% or so at the top marginal rate. And so their hit to their after-tax income is actually smaller than for those lower income Alaskans who don't have much of a federal tax burden. So they see the full amount of that reduction. On the other end of the spectrum is a progressive income tax, which would obviously tax income at higher rates for higher income Alaskans. And that would be quite progressive in structure. And the poorest households would bear effectively none of the incidence of that tax. The options in between in order of progressivity are a flat income tax, a narrow sales tax, which exclude categories of expenditures like food at home, which are particularly regressive. Then a broad sales tax, which would include those categories of expenditures, and then a property tax. We made some various assumptions about how property taxes would be passed through onto renters, and depending on what assumptions you make, this becomes more or less regressive. It's difficult to find data on precisely what that pass-through rate should be. We made a couple of reasonable assumptions, and it doesn't change all that much. So, last note on this is that higher income Alaskans could reduce their burden from these different options by itemizing their federal tax deductions. And so these would be kind of upper bound estimates for the after-tax or the upper after-tax burden for these higher income households. They just have the ability to make those deductions that lower income households do or don't, as their federal tax liability would make these deductions better than taking the standard deduction. This is another way to visualize that same figure, but rather than dollar values on the y-axis, this is a percentage of household income. But you can see the same pattern that PFD reductions would hit lower income Alaskans the hardest, reducing their income by as much as 3%, whereas progressive income tax would be relatively, or wouldn't have a hit on them at all, whereas on the opposite end of the spectrum, progressive income tax might reduce higher income Alaskans' household income by just under 1%. The final dimension that we evaluated was this question of who would pay. How would residents of Alaska, non-residents of Alaska, and the federal government pick up different tabs or shares of these fiscal option burdens? Again, we didn't have the data or specificity to estimate how spending changes or broad-based tax or broad business tax changes might affect resident versus non-residents of the state or the federal government. But we evaluated these other options that changed household income. These gray bars represents the share of revenue raised from Alaskans. The green bar represents the share raised from non-residents, either visitors or non-resident workers. And the yellow bar represents the share that would be picked up by the federal government through reductions in federal income tax payments. So what you can see here is that PFD reductions and property tax changes would be borne in the highest rates by Alaskans to the tune of about 86% apiece. The reason PFD reductions are so heavily faced by Alaska residents is because non-residents of the state of Alaska generally don't receive dividends, except for the small share of Alaskans that outmigrate every year but still collect a dividend payment. The federal government picks up some share of reductions in PFD expenditures, as that's no longer income that they're able to tax. And so they bear some of that burden. On the other end, we have these property tax changes. Again, Alaskans own a relatively large share of residential property in the state, so they pick up most of this tab. Non-residents do own residential property in the state of Alaska, so they pay some of this tax. And then payment of a statewide property tax is a deduction that Alaskans could claim against their federal income tax, and so there'd be some federal liability there too. A progressive income tax, we estimate around 83% of that burden would be faced by Alaskans. A flat income tax, we estimate that around 80% of that tax would be borne by Alaskans. A less exclusive or broader base sales tax, Alaskans would pick up to the tune of about 60 or 76%, and a more exclusive sales tax, Alaskans would pick up about 73% of the tab for. The reason that as you go from a broader base to a more exclusive sales tax pushes some of the incidents off onto non-residents is because you start to narrow in on the categories of expenditures that mostly tourists are buying. So tourists spend $4.5 billion in the Alaska economy or so a year. And as you shrink the tax base to include more exclusively the things that they tend to buy, the incidence on those non-residents increases. As I mentioned, we also modeled a couple of variations of these fiscal options. So one of those variations was an income tax where Alaskans could claim against their state tax liability either some or all of their permanent fund dividend as a tax credit. The idea here is that because non-residents wouldn't qualify for a dividend, they would still bear the full burden of a state income tax. But those higher income Alaskans that are currently paying federal income tax on their dividends would no longer pay that federal income tax, right? This state tax credit presumably would not be subject to federal income tax. And so we'd be able to push some of this incidence of an income tax further onto the federal government while maintaining it on non-resident workers in the state. That reduces the total burden of a flat income tax from about 80% to 70% for residents. We also modeled a seasonal sales tax. The idea here is to try to shift, again, the burden away from Alaska residents toward non-residents. As we know, most non-resident spending in Alaska occurs in the summer, principally because of our visitor industry, but that's also when a lot of non-resident workers show up to work in seasonal tourism jobs or out in the canneries. And so for those workers and visitors, increasing the tax rates as they're here and spending money in our economy and having lower rates the rest of the year, as you know, it's principally Alaska residents that are purchasing goods and services, pushes some of that burden off onto non-residents of the state. For each dollar raised, we estimate that depending on the assumptions that you make, you could shift some of the incidents 2 to 5 percentage points to non-residents. So think about for every dollar that the states raises from a sales tax, by using a seasonal sales tax, we would reduce the burden on Alaska families by 2 to 5 cents using a seasonal sales tax. The logic for this seasonal sales tax is kind of evident if you look around Southeast Alaska communities that already use this model to shift some of their tax burden to non-residents. Speaking, though, of some regional variation, is that outside the scope of our analysis are geographic differences. So we know that the economy of Alaska looks different depending on where you are located. And that can include things like pre-existing local taxes, whether or not a local community has a sales tax or it funds its local government primarily with sales taxes or property taxes or some other mechanism. That's not incorporated in our analysis. Everything that we do is statewide aggregate numbers. The distribution of income varies quite a bit across regions in Alaska. Obviously, we know that there are some wealthier regions and some poorer regions in the state. We're not modeling any of that level of detail. Again, we're taking a statewide aggregate perspective. And then importantly, there's different costs of goods and services in rural Alaska versus urban Alaska versus Southeast Alaska. That obviously would have impacts on those particular geographies that might make them differentially effective. But here again, we're looking at an aggregate picture for the state. Some other things that we considered as part of our evaluation was this idea that we wanted to think about revenue volatility from these different options. So many evaluations of expected revenue focus on just that, how much revenue we would expect to get from a given tax vehicle in a given year. But I think it's also important or informative to consider the volatility of that revenue. Generally speaking, if you look across the other states in the country and their revenue structures, states that have severance taxes tend to see the most volatility in that revenue. States that have corporate income taxes see somewhat less volatility, but there's volatility in that corporate income tax. Property taxes tend to be the least volatile. Property tax assessments tend to be stable over the course of the business cycle, although we can imagine there's a couple of important exceptions to that rule. While income taxes and sales taxes are in between, with income taxes being slightly more volatile than sales taxes. If you exclude revenue that the state of Alaska collects from the permanent fund through the POMV, Alaska's revenue is the most volatile in the country, and it's not even close. The next most volatile state in terms of revenue is North Dakota, which finances quite a bit of its state budget through severance taxes. But you generally see a picture as you look across these states that are more heavily reliant on those volatile sources of revenue, like corporate income taxes or severance taxes, tend to see more volatility. Interesting to note here, states like Nevada, which fund their state government heavily through sales taxes, principally borne by tourists, have a decent amount of revenue stability relative to some of these other states, which are financed through income taxes. This is another graph of just that same idea. This is revenue volatility for the 50 states over a 15-year period ending in fiscal year 2022. These data were put together by the Pew Charitable Trust, which is the source for that map that we were just looking at. You can see that severance tax revenue in this blue line here bounces around quite a bit. The orange line is the corporate income tax revenue that these states are collecting. That bounces around too, but it's the bandwidth is smaller, right? The volatility is less. Personal income taxes are also a little volatile as we go through economic expansions and contractions, while sales taxes are the most stable of these different sources of revenue, at least in the experience of the other states. And then the final thing that we did as part of this project was we considered the impact of no action. So what if the state doesn't take any action at all? So in FY27, we have a forecasted price of $62 a barrel. Late last month, ANS prices were at $65 a barrel, and I think that's where they've been hanging out for the last couple of weeks, is in that mid to high 60s range. But note that for every dollar that oil changes, averaged over the course of the year, state revenue changes by $34 million. And so we could be in a situation where if oil prices dip below our forecast of $62 a barrel and stay there, such that the average change over the course of the year was a few dollars a barrel less, we could be in a situation where we'd need to raise $100 million to plug a hole. So we have quite volatile revenue from oil. We've diversified some of that revenue using the POMV. But it's important to note that the state could be forced to take some action, either withdrawing more from savings or one of these other fiscal options if we don't potentially address this issue. I think it's also important to note that doing nothing also has a cost, an economic cost. We've estimated that the fiscal uncertainty that was created by the state's budget situation in 2016 cost the state 2 to 3 percentage points of its GDP. Or 2 to 3% of its GDP. So state GDP is $60 to $70 billion. And so we're talking about billions of dollars of lost economic activity by not completely addressing the state's fiscal situation then. And then finally, I think another reason to consider alternatives to this no action alternative is that our current sources of revenue in petroleum and the permanent fund percent of market value aren't explicitly tied to state economic activity. So many Alaskan economists have dubbed this the so-called Alaska disconnect. The idea here is that as our economy grows, as our economy shrinks, because petroleum is representing a smaller and smaller share of our state's private sector economic activity, the fluctuations in oil prices are increasingly divorced from what the rest of our economy is doing. If the rest of our economy is growing while oil prices are falling, that puts downward pressure on state revenue. So the state's able to do less things despite growth in our economy, maybe even a growing population with more roads to service or children to educate. Wouldn't it be a lovely problem for the Anchorage School District to have to see student populations rising? But if oil prices are falling, that means less revenue potentially that the state has available to it for things like education, healthcare, infrastructure. And so without an explicit linkage between the revenue that the state has available to it to provide services and the services that might be demanded from the population as the economy changes, there's this disconnect. And so despite the fact that the POMV has provided a new and diverse source of revenue, growth in that revenue is not explicitly coupled to the broader economic activity in the state. And then there's also a fairly tangible and practical cost here that our state's bond rating with fiscal uncertainty increases our borrowing costs. When Standards & Poor or Moody's evaluates the surety of our credit, and our bond ratings are negatively impacted by fiscal uncertainty, that just provides real interest costs when we go to borrow in the bond market, and that's a tangible expenditure on our debt that is reflected in some of this uncertainty. So this is my TLDR slide for those of you that are fairly well versed in the ISER 2016 study. Maybe you've been thinking about it for the last 10 years and are curious about how our results compare to the 2016 results. So as I mentioned, one of the things we did was we expanded the scope of 2016. So 2016 only modeled the short run. We're modeling the long run. But as I showed you in that previous slide with the employment changes, those long run effects 25 years from now look a lot like the short run impacts. And so even though we expanded the scope to include a lot more time into the future, that doesn't have much bearing on which of these options we might weigh against another. Similarly, when we evaluated impacts and we compare, how many jobs would be lost today versus how many jobs would be lost then from raising $100 million to service a state deficit, we found that our impacts are generally smaller than the ones that they evaluated in 2016. Why is that? Well, one key reason is just inflation. So inflation has run about 30%, or we've seen about 30%, 25% inflation since 2016. If we're measuring a $100 million change now and a $100 million change then, well, $100 million just doesn't buy you what it did 10 years ago. And so inflation has eroded away some of those impacts, as $100 million means less today than it did then. But the structure of our economy has also changed. Unfortunately, our economy now experiences more leakage, meaning that money doesn't circulate in our economy as with the same velocity that it did 10 years ago, mostly because of online retail spending. And so when people purchase from from an online retailer, that money leaves the economy very quickly. And so that sort of change has driven smaller impacts. If you remove $100 million from the economy today versus then, it's not recirculating as quickly today. And so that results in smaller impacts. On this question of who pays, though, we do find a more subtle, but I think important difference that in 2016, they found that Alaskans would pay 80 to 84%, regardless of which of those broad revenue options were adopted: PFD cuts, property taxes, income taxes, sales taxes. Alaskans would pick up about 80 to 84% of the tab. Today, we find a broader range of these impacts. Generally, we found that the lowest impacts for Alaskans would come from sales taxes because the size of our visitor industry has grown so much. But importantly, the reason that income taxes, even though we have a larger non-resident workforce today than we did then, the reason that income taxes would have more effect on Alaska residents is because of those changes that were made to the federal tax code. Without Alaskans' ability to deduct state income tax liability against their federal income tax liability in the same way that they did then, that pushes more of that income tax burden onto Alaska residents because the feds aren't picking up as much of that tab. So directionally, this is what we found. The time frame has relatively little impact on what we find. Economic impacts are a little bit smaller for the reasons I've mentioned. Alaskans pick up slightly less of the tab from a sales tax, slightly more of the tab from an income tax for the reasons that I mentioned. Yep. Perfect. That's it.
So now we have time for some audience Q&A. To join Brett up here, I would love to welcome both Spencer, Brock, and Tyson. In case you have any questions about the governor's policy, Tyson is the resident expert. And then both Spencer and Brock have their own specialties within ISER who can answer questions. And Brett, I'll let you choose the people in the audience.
Sure.
You know.
And yeah, just to introduce Brock and Spencer, my co-authors on the study. Also joined with us today is Noah Burke, one of the other co-authors on the study. This was a big team effort. We had every economist at ISER work on this for 6 months. So it was a lot of work. And we touched maybe a quarter of maybe the material. So yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much for a very interesting and impressive presentation, and thank you for bringing your team here today. My question is going to go back to earlier in your presentation. I think you said that the Alaska economy was essentially flat from 2017 to now. It was that straight line basically across. My question is, in that kind of situation, what kind of impact can state government have, whether it's the executive branch or the legislative branch? How can the state government somehow impact that line to move it presumably better up, to try and move it up?
So, that's exactly the type of thing that we were thinking about as part of this evaluation is particularly as we've modeled some of these long run dynamic changes, trying to think about how these scenarios would impact the economy over a 10, 20-year time frame. One of the possibilities that we have is to, leverage combinations of these options to provide budget neutral pro-growth policy. So there's configurations of these options that would promote economic growth, also potentially provide additional revenue to the state, and provide incentives for economic opportunity. We didn't evaluate any specific combinations of proposals as part of this analysis, but one of the things that we have available on the ISER website, and I believe Ross is also putting together kind of a similar tool for Commonwealth North, is thinking about different configurations of these policies that are budget neutral or maybe even budget positive and also pro-growth, right? That's sort of the secret sauce here. And there are any number of configurations of options, right? Limitless possibilities for how these options can be configured in a pro-growth and budget neutral way. I'm curious, Tyson, if you have specific comments on how the governor is thinking about his policy fitting that bill.
Yeah, thank you, Brett. And I just want to take a second. I want to thank the ISER team for all there was a ton of work, and I'm sure it wasn't what they were planning on doing with their second half here. So I really want to say thank you to ISER and to Brett's comment really early in his presentation. The intransigence around the issue, I think it's just fatigue, and talk about this year after year after year, and nothing ever happens, and people just kind of go on with their lives. So they know it's there, but they're not engaged and actively participating in it. And so, I'm hopeful the legislature takes the plan we put forward and talks about it, makes some changes and adds to it to make it better and enacts it. But even if they don't, put the issue back on the table for everybody is a really important step forward. So I do want to thank you guys. And I think the governor, I'm sure you've heard and read him say he wants a comprehensive plan, doesn't want a tax and spend plan, because he's really thinking about the Alaskan economy as a whole, not just the money to the treasury to fund the private sector. And I think, we're short on time here. I think reducing volatility and providing more stability to where the state gets its revenue from and what that revenue is going to look like every year is a really important policy goal for the state. I can tell you, I can go to bed one day and I wake up the next morning and the state's revenue picture for the year in front of us will change like 9 figures. And it's a substantial thing to have to be accountable to that every day. I mean, for better or worse, like I woke up and read that Maduro had gotten captured, and the first thing I thought was, oh, the price of oil is right now, right? So I think everybody here knows that we have a pretty tricky economy. It's a pretty unique economy. Our private sector economy is very intertwined in government, right? I think we all know that. That's what I learned growing up in the state. And so the governor was very sensitive to pro-growth policies. It's reducing, first of all, we have a responsibility to do as much as we can to leave this in as good a shape as possible for whoever comes next. So that's what ultimately drives why are we putting a fiscal plan forward in our last year. Reducing volatility, increasing stability is good for the business sector. It's good for anybody who's looking to invest money. We're working hard to pursue data centers to invest in Alaska right now. And we had one tell us, we were pitching all the great things about Alaska and joking and talking about California having high taxes. And they're like, hey, you're right. But we know what their taxes are going to be, so we can prepare for that. Yours, you have none, which is awesome. But we don't know what they're going to be next year, and we don't want the volatility. And so we want to cultivate more growth in the state. We want to cultivate more investment. We frankly would be interested in building more schools to the state's economic, more legs to the state's economic stool, diversifying and making Alaska kind of more normal like the other 50 states. A revenue stabilizer in the form of a broad-based tax really does provide that surety. SB 26 and the POMB took the state's proportion of oil revenue that funded this budget from somewhere around high 70s down to I think it's around 40 now. So that was a huge step forward. It's a huge step forward. If we can take another huge step forward and start to minimize that volatility even more, then it gives businesses the confidence to invest here that we're not going to come around and change the numbers on them in some substantial way. That we can kind of take advantage of the inputs we have and overcome the high cost of doing business. Thank you.
Ross, I saw a couple of comments in the chat online. I don't know if
Those were me.
Oh, those were you. Okay,
Other
great.
people, they ask questions, but.
Yeah.
Yeah, my name's Greg, please. I have a question. But first of all, let me say I really admire your work. You've been something that's really important, valuable. But I'm curious just about the model. I haven't read the 2016 report, and I will read this, and I'll go back and read the 2016. But I'm just curious about what have you taken the 2016 econometric model and just updated the data, or have you reshaped the analysis?
So yes, and step one of this project was to take exactly what they did in 2016 and just turn the crank on it a little bit by updating the data. And so that was step one. We found largely this, right? Then the next step was to incorporate another set of modeling. Just to pull back the curtain a little bit, we use two kind of leading commercial pieces of software to do economic modeling at ISER. We do modeling with a software called IMPLAN, which is kind of the workhorse economic impact model. But that's the short-run static analysis that I mentioned. So that's what ISER did in 2016 was IMPLAN analysis. It makes a number of assumptions about the economy that make it fairly rigid. It constrains assumptions about consumers and firms in ways that's, I think, stretches credibility. But one of the nice things about IMPLAN is because it's so commonly used, you can compare one set of IMPLAN numbers to another and get kind of an idea of the proportional impacts across different scenarios. Then we add to that modeling a different piece of software called REMI, which is a regional modeling software, which combines both econometric modeling and regional impact modeling, or an input-output matrix in a structural model. What that allows us to do, and again, this is commercial software, kind of off-the-shelf stuff that we are putting the Alaska data into and some of our own assumptions about these scenarios. But what that allows us to do is allow firms and households to respond more dynamically to these changes and track them over time. As there's important feedback loops which aren't incorporated in that short run modeling. So that's, like I said, what's going on behind the hood here is we're using these two pieces of off-the-shelf commercial software and then parameterizing them with some Alaska data. When we're doing analysis of incidents and how different households of different statuses are affected, this is all from public survey data, like the American Community Survey, public use microdata, so that we can understand, impacts of these different scenarios. IRS tax records, publicly available IRS tax data that are computed at an aggregate level, and then some information from the Bureau of Economic Analysis to understand national accounts.
One, just a follow-up.
Yeah.
Brief follow-up, if I may. Do you have any indication that the 2016 report conclusion informed policy?
I have no idea. I certainly
You'll ask the former legislators.
Is the implication that this line might in fact be causal? No, but it's certainly a study that I heard cited a lot and continued to hear cited up until our new analysis came out. That some of the best information that we have about the impacts of these various changes on the economy and on households in the state was produced in 2016 by ISER then. And my hope for this work is that this will continue to provide information to the public conversation, either during this round of the legislative session as part of the governor's proposal, and if not now, then in the governor's race coming this year or in the next legislative session. Like I said, I think that we've got a real opportunity in the state to make some changes, and I hope that this can be informative for that.
And I think the report did have credibility and was held up by policymakers. These guys have credibility that, we don't have. And so, we hired them to do the work, not endorse our plan. We just kind of wanted to do a check and see if we were on the right track. But I think policymakers by and large really respect ISER and the work that they do.
Yeah, I had a question. I think Senator Giesel came up with some nice graphs you've probably seen that indicated that the primary revenue is coming from investments now. And the second was like some 47%, 36% is coming from the federal government, 9.6% is coming from the oil industry. And if we expand into the National Petroleum Reserve, which is federal, and you indicate that we don't have the taxation structure available in that, I don't know how the oil and gas revenue can really help that much. I know you talked about S corporations and other things going on with book clubs, but I really think that if they cut federal spending as they have been indicating, even though we may have more pro-development, we may not get a share of it, even if they work offshore outside our areas. So, I mean, just the revenue flow is one of my main concerns. And the other is, I work for the legislature. When they cut the taxes, the ACEs on the tax structure on the petroleum industries, when they said that if they were given tax reductions, they were going to pull the plug on production. So again, I see the same things going on now for 10 years. I don't see a lot of difference. The legislature's under tremendous pressure every time just to come up with a budget, and the governor's fighting the same thing. And yet we see the outflow of people and the decline in business activity. And I can only compare what's going on here to the boom years when we first started pumping real oil. I mean, it was the main thing back in the 80s, and then you could see the Project 80s in Anchorage and all the other things going on. It brings people in when you had the economic activity. I hope that just shuffling the ideas of money around is not going to be the answer, whether it's going to be taxation or if it's going to for sales taxes or income taxes. There has to be a needle moving here that's going to give us more revenue.
So we got a couple questions online. One question is the most stable. So it looks like the most stable taxes are the most regressive. Yes, so like more or less. Okay. Secondly, I use Nevada as an example of having a stable fiscal situation because of sales tax. Is there any difference between the fact that they have 35 to 40 million visitors per year, creating that stability, versus the 3 million that come to Alaska?
Well, so this was I point out Nevada in response to one of the questions that we've gotten about how economies that are heavily dependent on a visitor industry might see more volatility in their sales tax base than economies that are less visitor dependent. Note Nevada, right, had relatively more stable revenue. Nevada heavily reliant on sales taxes, reliant on the visitor industry, particularly for that sales tax base. But Nevada's still seeing more revenue stability than even surrounding states that are more reliant on income taxes.
Doesn't Nevada get income from just gambling? I mean, we say that sales tax, but I mean, they have
So-
that gambling.
That's right. So the point here is that as we think about a business cycle going from economic expansion to economic contraction, what are the parts of the economy that are most responsive to the business cycle change? So one of the things that you see contraction in, well, first of all, you see commodity price changes, and so that's why severance taxes are so volatile, is because as you move over the course of the business cycle, you have a lot of fluctuation in commodity prices. The next largest component of fluctuation in the economy is corporate income. Right, businesses see reductions in their profitability that reduces the corporate tax base as they see less consumer purchase or as they see reduced profitability, particularly business to business transactions. But another important place in which the economy pulls back during a contraction is in discretionary spending on things like vacations. And so, if you were concerned about more volatility in revenue from a sales tax where the base was heavily visitor dependent, you'd want to check that against some states that are, heavily visitor dependent, like Nevada, Hawaii. Hawaii's revenue is a little bit more volatile than some of the other states, but certainly less than any state that's severance tax dependent. In fact, I was looking yesterday. The states with the most volatility in their sales taxes are North Dakota, Wyoming, and New Mexico, all of which have important resource industries. And so you see the influence of the resource industry or changes in commodity prices even reflected in their sales taxes.
Hi, I wondering how you follow property tax. I know one of the things I'm most familiar with is Hampshire has property tax, but our property tax is somewhat interesting here.
That's right. Yeah. So we modeled our analysis off the 2016 analysis, which also included a residential property tax. So we use information for organized boroughs, property tax assessed values in the organized boroughs, and made some inference based on the size of residential property tax base in the organized boroughs and what the size of the property tax might be in the unorganized boroughs. And so that was the baseline to understand what the size of the base might be. And then we look at the public use microdata sample of the American Community Survey. So that's the household survey. And look at property tax values, which are self-reported by those individuals, to get a sense of what the incidence of that tax are. So those are the two components of the model.
Yes.
Just residential, exactly. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. Existing property taxes. It's not, no.
I will say the 2016 report had a lot of impact as far as the business question.
You made an interesting comment about online sales but wouldn't the imposition of a sales tax lead to more online sales? And I mean, it may not be that big. I mean, how much more online sales can there be might be one of those things. Did you take that into consideration? I mean, it's like one of these things that two different kind of statements.
Yeah. So, Brock, are you gonna? No, go for it.
I imagine with Remy updating the new model, they've accounted for this leakage factor, and I wouldn't be able to speak too much about that.
Yeah, well, so I mean, there's definitely a potential concern that the response, like the level of response that we would see to a sales tax of importing things from other states, like through online retail, might not be, specifically calibrated to Alaska, which might be different than the rest of the country. But that dynamic model is going to account for if we raise the sales tax on things bought and sold here, that's going to lead to some additional imports as people substitute away from the more heavily taxed goods in Alaska for that online retail. So the dynamic model does capture that substitution, but how perfect it is capturing that, I'm not.
Well, I was going to say, one of the other things that, again, was outside the scope of our analysis was the implementation of any particular policy. And so a sales tax policy may or may not include online sales as part of that description. Another important issue is compliance. whether or not we're going to go verify the point of purchase of any particular item. I think that as House Finance was debating the governor's package last week, there was quite a bit of conversation around what would the point of compliance or enforcement be? How much enforcement effort should the state put forward to enforcing self-reported sales tax or self-reported expenditures out of state for something like a vehicle purchase as it's brought into state? You'd need to shore those up. And certainly for higher ticket items, the state might put forward more compliance effort. So at the point of registration where you pay a sales tax on a vehicle, might be easier to enforce then, but for smaller items, clothing or something, it'd probably more difficult. I guess we could have people at the airport, checking luggage. But like I said, that's a policy question about what level of enforcement effort we'd want on something like that.